So here's the fox pretending to be a doctor investigating Pinocchio's illness, and he makes some notes which is all just meaningless scribble, right? It's like white noise, and it doesn't matter that the arguments that he's making are completely incoherent, and it doesn't matter that he actually doesn't know anything. What he's selling is easy to buy, and so Pinocchio buys it. And by the end of the conversation with the fox, he's pretty convinced that he's useless and that he needs a vacation. You know, this is an edible situation as well, which I touched on in the other lecture. I mean, let's imagine that you have a child that is a little on the neurotic side, so high negative emotion, and maybe one that's also a little bit on the sickly side, so has a variety of, let's say, relatively minor ailments, but ailments nonetheless. And so what that means as a parent, we'll say mother for this example, because I want to use the Oedipal example, you have to make a decision all the time about exactly how you're going to treat that child. One decision is, well, you don't have to go to school today because you're not feeling well. It's like, fair enough. But do you make the same decision the next day? And do you make the same decision the next day? And let's imagine that you enable the child to avoid responsibility as a consequence of capitalizing on their illness. Well, then that's not going to be very good for the child. The rule with a sickly child has to be something like, I'm going to push you right to your limit. Because otherwise, how is the person going to figure out what they can do? And if they can't figure out what they can do, then they're not going to be able to make their way in the world at all. And then that gets muddied very badly if you're not exactly sure that you want them to make their way in the world. You know, maybe you're just as happy because you'd be sitting at home alone if your child was there with you. And maybe you'd be just as happy at some level if they never grew up at all, because then they won't leave. And maybe that's because you have a terrible marriage and you're lonesome, you know. Maybe it's an abusive marriage and your husband has chased away all your friends, and so you don't have anything at all. And maybe that's because you didn't stand up for yourself very well, apart from the fact that he was, you know, tyrannical in his central nature. And so then all those little warps and bends in your psyche are going to manifest themselves right in the background of every single one of those decisions. My daughter had a lot of illnesses when she was adolescent, and they were very serious, and it was very difficult to figure out what to do about that, because you couldn't exactly apply normative rules, right? And we always had to figure out, if she was communicating her symptoms to us, how seriously to take those. And the answer was the least amount of serious possible. It's something like that, because we needed to know, and she needed to know, what she could do in spite of the fact that she had problems. And one of the things I really tried to instill in her, and I think it worked, is that you don't ever want to use your illness as an excuse for not doing anything. Not consciously. You know, sometimes you might not know, I'm not feeling well, what can I do? Well, you don't know, right? Because sometimes when you're not feeling well, you can do more than you think, and sometimes you can do less than you think. It's not like it's obvious, but sometimes it's obvious, you know, this little temptation flits through your mind and you think, well, I don't really want to do what I'm doing today, and I'm not feeling very well, so I don't have to do it. You do that 100 times, then you don't know how sick you are anymore. And then you're in real trouble, because not only are you sick, but you've muddied the waters. And so you have both problems then, is you're actually ill and you've betrayed yourself by using that as an excuse not to pursue your responsibilities. There's a deep idea in the West too. It's like, pick up your damn suffering and bear it and try to be a good person so you don't make it worse. Well, that's a truth. Life is suffering. Yes. Well, who wants to admit that? Well, just think about it. Well, so what do you do in the face of that suffering? Try to reduce it. Start with yourself. What good are you? Get yourself together, for Christ's sake, so that when your father dies, you're not whining away in a corner, and you can help plan the funeral, and you can stand up solidly so that people can rely on you. That's better. Don't be a damn victim. Of course you're a victim. Jesus, obviously. Put yourself together. And that's the other message of the West. It's like, how do you overcome the suffering of life? And I'm not saying it's only the message of the West. How do you overcome the suffering of life? Is be a better person. That's how you do it. Well, that's hard. It takes responsibility. And I think, if you said to someone, you want to have a meaningful life? Everything you do matters. That's the definition of a meaningful life. But everything you do matters. So you're going to have to carry that with you. Or do you want to just forget about the whole meaning thing, and then you don't have any responsibility because who the hell cares, and you can wander through life doing whatever you want, gratifying impulsive desires for how useful that's going to be, and you're stuck in meaninglessness, but you don't have any responsibility. Which one do you want? Well, ask yourself, which one are you pursuing? Get yourself together. Transcend your suffering. See if you can be some kind of hero. Make the suffering in the world less. Well, that's the way forward, as far as I can tell, if there is any way forward.
So I have a friend, he's a really good friend of mine, and I've known him since I was in college, and he's a tough guy. I mean, he grew up in under rather poverty-stricken circumstances in northern Alberta, really on a frontier piece of land, like it had only been broken 50 years before by his father, who was a longshoreman and an ex-military guy. Good guy, right. His father. But this guy grew up, and he is tough. He worked in lead smelters, and he wandered around Western Canada. He was my roommate when I went to college, and is still a good friend of mine. And he ended up working with, like, delinquents. He went into social work, oddly enough, and he ended up working with some of the worst delinquents in Canada. And he's a really good guy, and he likes to help people get better. But he isn't naive at all. And then part of the reason that he was good at working with the delinquents was because there were no tricks they could get up to that he couldn't see right through. And that was partly because he had a real integrated shadow. I mean, I'll give you an example of him. So one day, I was living in this town called Grand Prairie, and it was at the height of the oil boom. And so it was a rough town, and there were lots of rough bars in it, and lots of young men in there with plenty of money and they come in for 3 days after being out in minus 40 weather, working on the oil rigs, and they were ready to party, man. And we had a party one night in this kind of frat house that I went to college in, and way too many people showed up, and some of them were real troublemakers. And we had a table that was pretty full of beer bottles and vodka bottles and so forth, and one guy just went over, like, tore the leg off and knocked the table over, and then a bunch of us got together and chased them all out. And this friend of mine, he said, oh, they'll be back. And so he went upstairs and he put on some steel-toed cowboy boots. It was just like a bloody western. He came marching down the stairs, and just as he entered the living room, there was a big knock on the front door. It was these hooligans coming back to cause grief, and he just didn't break stride. He opened the door. He pulled open the door, and there was a guy standing there ready to fight, and he kicked him underneath the chin with his steel-toed cowboy boot, knocked him right over the front porch, and the battle was on. But that was exactly what he was like, I mean, and his shadow was integrated. He was a great roommate. He reciprocated everything. I always knew if I bought groceries one week, he'd buy it the next. Like, he was a straight shooter. You could trust him. But he was not naive, man. And that made him able to deal with delinquents and to help them. So that's part of that integration of that shadow.